the thing that walked beside us. This happened 15 years ago on a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail in the mountains, where the tree cover is so thick that even midday feels like late afternoon, and I still remember the exact section because it sat between two shelters nearly 9 miles apart, which meant once you committed to it, there were very few ways out. And at the time, I welcomed that isolation because I believed solitude would clear my head after a difficult year. But instead, it introduced me to something that walked beside me for hours without ever letting me see it. The morning began normally enough, cool air hanging low between the ridges, birds active in the canopy, and the dirt trails still damp from light rain the night before. I set off alone after passing the last group of hikers at the previous shelter. Feeling confident in my pace and supplies, unaware that by the end of the day, I would begin questioning every sound that followed my steps. About 2 hours into the hike, after the forest had grown noticeably denser and the path narrowed into a single winding line of packed earth, I first heard what I thought was another hiker somewhere behind me, a faint but steady crunch of leaves that seemed spaced in rhythm with my own boots. I didn't think much of it at first because hikers often travel quietly, but when I slowed my pace slightly to let whoever was behind catch up, the sound slowed as well, maintaining distance. And when I stopped completely to drink water, the forest fell completely silent, as if someone had muted it. I stood there longer than necessary, turning slowly to scan the stretch of trail behind me that curved gently out of sight. And I saw nothing, not even a flicker of movement between the trunks, yet I had been certain moments earlier that someone was walking there. I shrugged it off and continued forward, but within less than a minute the crunch returned subtle and measured 2 steps, followed by a slight pause, then 2 more, and it mirrored my pace so closely that I began to feel a quiet unease settle in my chest. When I stopped again without warning, the sound took 1 extra half step before halting, as if whatever was making it needed a split second to adjust. And that small delay made my stomach tighten in a way that logic could not calm. I called out casually, asking if someone was back there and needed to pass. But the only answer was the distant hum of insects and the soft shifting of branches high above, and no voice answered me. The longer it continued, the clearer it became that the steps were not random forest noise, because they maintained spacing, weight, and timing in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. By early afternoon, the terrain shifted slightly uphill. The trail ran along the side of a ridge where the trees grew close together, creating a natural wall on either side, and that was when the sound changed position. Instead of following directly behind me, the steps moved to my left, just beyond the tree line that ran parallel to the trail, matching my pace, but now separated by only a few feet of dense brush and trunks. I could hear leaves compressing under pressure, not heavy enough to suggest a large animal crashing through, but steady enough to indicate something keeping stride with me deliberately. I refused to look at first because I didn't want to confirm what my instincts were beginning to suggest, but eventually I turned my head slowly toward the trees, expecting to catch a glimpse of movement between the gaps. There was nothing visible, only layered trunks, patches of shadow, and filtered light slipping through leaves, yet the sound remained clearly present, walking beside me with the same calm rhythm. That was the moment I realized this was not coincidence, because the forest floor on that side was thick with fallen branches and uneven ground, and no human could have maintained that steady pace without breaking something or breathing hard enough for me to hear. I told myself it had to be a deer moving parallel to the trail, but the longer I listened, the more that explanation felt weak, because deer do not match human pace with such exact rhythm, and they certainly do not pause precisely when a person pauses. Yet every time I slowed or stopped, the steps adjusted within a second or two. Never perfectly instant, but always close enough to suggest awareness rather than instinct. I tried to prove myself wrong by changing my pace without warning, first quickening my steps for several minutes, and then slowing abruptly as if to tie my boot. And each time the unseen movement in the trees reacted with a slight delay that felt calculated rather than coincidental. Branches shifting and leaves compressing at the same relative distance from the trail, though whatever was moving out there was careful to remain just far enough away to stay concealed while still keeping me within reach of its awareness. The forest itself seemed unaware of the tension building between us, birds still calling from deeper within the canopy, and the wind pushing softly through the leaves overhead, yet beneath those ordinary sounds. I could now isolate the second rhythm clearly, heavier than falling debris, lighter than a person crashing through brush, deliberate. In its spacing, and most disturbing of all, was the consistency, because it never rushed and never stumbled. Moving with a steady patience that suggested confidence, I told myself that if it were a person, I would have seen a flash of color through the trees by now. A sleeve, a backpack, some unnatural straight line breaking the organic chaos of the undergrowth. But there was nothing except shifting shadows and vertical trunks stretching endlessly into the filtered light. That the absence of visual confirmation made the experience feel less like being followed and more like being studied from a dimension just out of sight. After nearly half an hour of this parallel movement, my nerves began to fray in ways I did not want to admit, because fear on a trail like that can distort judgment. And the last thing I wanted was to panic and make poor decisions miles from the nearest road. So instead I focused on breathing steadily, keeping my stride measured. Pretending that I had accepted the presence as a harmless coincidence, even though every instinct was telling me the pattern was too precise to ignore, the terrain gradually began to slope upward, toward a rocky incline where the trees thinned slightly. And for the first time since the footsteps began, I considered the possibility that the elevation change might force whatever was out there to reveal itself. Since climbing through dense brush alongside the trail would require more effort and potentially create more noise than before. As I ascended the incline, my breathing deepened and my boots scraped against loose stone. And almost immediately, the parallel movement grew louder as well. Not chaotic, but strained branches snapping with sharper cracks, and foliage rustling in longer bursts, as though the thing pacing me had adjusted its route to compensate for the steeper ground without once falling behind. Halfway up the incline, I stopped abruptly. Not gradually this time, but in a sudden freeze meant to catch it off guard. And for a brief heartbeat, the forest held its breath with me before a final step landed somewhere to my right. Slightly closer than before, followed by absolute stillness that felt intentional rather than accidental. That was the first moment I felt genuine fear rather than unease, because the distance had changed subtly but unmistakably. And the realization that it could close space whenever it chose made the earlier miles of steady pacing feel less like coincidence and more like a demonstration of restraint. I resisted the urge to call out, knowing that if it were a person, the silence would confirm malicious intent. And if it were an animal, my voice might provoke something unpredictable. So instead I resumed walking at a controlled pace, though my senses were now sharpened to a painful degree. Every twig snap amplified, every gust of wind scrutinized for hidden movement. The incline eventually leveled into a narrow ridge, where the trail hugged the side of a drop-off. And on the opposite side, the forest thickened again into dense growth. And within moments of reaching that section, the second rhythm resumed its earlier spacing, once again matching my pace at that careful distance, as though the brief advance up the slope had merely been a reminder of its capability. With the ridge limiting visibility on one side and thick vegetation crowding the other, I felt exposed in a way that made the air seem thinner. Because if something decided to step onto the trail, there would be nowhere to veer without risking a fall. And that awareness made every synchronized footstep behind the tree line carry a heavier psychological weight. I tested it again by stopping near a bend in the trail where the canopy opened slightly, and true to the established pattern, the movement continued one step after. I froze before halting as well, that small delay now feeling almost conversational, as if we were locked in a silent exchange where each of my actions prompted a measured reply. For a moment I considered turning and charging into the brush just to force a confrontation and end the uncertainty, but the thickness of the undergrowth and the impossibility of predicting what might be waiting within it kept me rooted to the path, and I realized that whatever this was, it understood something about boundaries, choosing to remain just outside direct engagement while never relinquishing proximity. The trail sign ahead indicated that the nearest shelter was still a few miles away, and the thought of reaching a structure with solid beams and a defined clearing offered some small comfort. Yet as I continued forward with that goal in mind, the steady, measured rhythm resumed beside me, unwavering and patient, as if fully aware that we would be traveling together for the remainder of the distance, whether I welcomed the company or not.